Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paweł Kaczmarczyk, and I'm heading the Center of Migration Research at the moment. And it's my real pleasure and privilege also to welcome you, even if virtually only, at the University of Warsaw. And the pleasure is even bigger because today we are going to discuss results of one of many projects we have at the Center of Migration Research, but one particular project that, in my opinion, quite nicely mirrors the change we are experiencing at the center since a few decades. As you probably know, when we started in the mid-1990s, the main area of interest for us at the CMR were migrations of Poles, so mobility of Polish citizens. Today, most of our projects are focusing on the integration in Poland, so inflow of foreigners to Poland. And that's why what we are going to discuss today is of high interest, not only for you, I mean the participants of today's seminar, but also for the CMR as such. So I guess without further delay, I will just pass right now the floor to the leader of the Polish team, Dr. Karolina Sobczak-Szelc. And I will, of course, I will stay with you, and hopefully I will also join the discussion. Karolina?
Thank you, Director, for this very warm welcome and these warm words at the beginning of our meeting. My name is Karolina Sobczak-Szelc. I've got the pleasure to be the leader, as it was already said, of this project. And today we are going to present results of one of the latest reports that were prepared by our Polish team dedicated to integration of migrants, especially refugees in Poland. However, before this happened, let me say a couple of words about the project as such and our methodology, just for a reminder, and also somehow an introduction for those who did not have the possibility to follow our project from the early beginning. So the general aim of this project was to provide in-depth understanding of recent mass, especially forced migration and its consequences. And it was in order to enhance the migration governance capacity and policy coherence of the EU, its member states and third countries. It had also more precise objectives that were, among others, the systematic overview of contextual factors driving recent migration, identify existing governance capacities, to explore the integration capacity in selected countries, to study the role of key non-governmental and civil actors, and finally, what will be also the aim of our today presentations, to produce some policy recommendation for further governance of migration, mass migration, especially forced migration. The project was focused on forced migration, understood as those who apply for or are willing to apply for protection in any of European or border to Europe countries, and also those who already received any kind of protection. The time range was from 2011 because of the Arab Spring and these changes in the approach and the changes in influx to Europe of migrants, and with special emphasis on the situation from 2015, which, as all of us know, was the year of so-called migration crisis or refugee crisis, and so-called. The focus was mostly on the Eastern Mediterranean route, as you can see on the list or the map, where are shown all countries involved. We had, let's call it that it was divided into different levels of inquiry. So regarding the governance, we were looking at macro level, supranational and national, meso, that was subnational local political actors, local administration and NGOs, and micro level, where we focused on individual asylum seekers and refugees as active actors. There were also three themes: action, so capacities of political initiatives; inaction, policy vacuum, or reactions, so interactions between macro, meso, and micro level actors. We also looked at 3 regions, so how the governance looked in transit and destination countries, and also at source countries. However, that was mostly as what kind of push factors force people to movement. And project was carried by 14 partners from 11 countries, by researchers from 7 different disciplines, among others political science, law, anthropology, psychology of religion, geography, sociology, and economics. We ended up with research that were carried in 11 countries. In over 66 cities, we received more than 715 interviews with stakeholders and refugees or asylum seekers. And going to our Polish team, let me introduce those who were involved in the project. Although you will listen today just to 4 of us, that's me, Marta Pachocka, Konrad Pędziwiat, and Justyna Szałańska. In the project were involved also Anita Brzozowska, Agata Górny, and Basia Jancewicz, who were involved into survey study that was carried in Turkey and Sweden. And also we cooperated with Gagi Gregorian and Feras Dabul, who supported us deeply during in-depth interviews. In Poland, we mostly relied on qualitative approach. We carried 30 micro-level interviews with migrants with different statuses. They were carried between July 2018 and August 2019. We also carried 60 meso-level interviews that were carried with representatives of central public institutions, local governments, NGOs, practitioners. Time period was more or less the same. Those interviews or the results of these interviews were supported by discussions carried during our Respond Migration Governance Network roundtable discussions. The analysis was supported by NVivo software. So going more precisely into with whom we were talking to, regarding micro-level in-depth interviews, there were mostly, majority of them were carried with Chechens. This group was followed by Ukrainians and Syrians. There were a couple of interviews with Iraqis and one with Yemeni and Kazakh interviewees. And regarding their legal status, 30 of them were asylum seekers in the time of interview, 4 received refugee status, 11 were under subsidiary protection, 2 either did not mention their status or, let's say it this way. Regarding the meso-level in-depth interviews, 6 were carried with workers or practitioners of NGOs, 3 with practitioners that were either those who are working with refugees in field, 4 with officers from Office for Foreigners, 2 with local governors, and 1 with border guard. Till now, we had 2 roundtable discussions. First was in December 2018, and the second in January of this year. In those roundtable discussion participated representatives of international organizations, public administration, NGOs, researchers, independent experts, as well as refugee. And at this moment, our results are already available in 6 reports dedicated to different topics. First is more descriptive, and based on the literature review and statistical data that is dedicated to legal and policy framework of migration governance. Second, dedicated to border management and migration control. Third, refugee protection, Poland, refugee protection. Fourth, dedicated to reception policies and practices and responses. Fifth, that we are going to present some results of is dedicated to integration policies, practices, and experiences. And sixth, the most, I would say that it's like a very fresh report because it was published last week, if I'm not wrong, the time is going so fast. It's dedicated to conflicting conceptualization of, is entitled Conflicted Conceptualization of Europeization, and dedicated to the analysis of discourse of politicians in Poland. And as I said, there was also the last part that is not still not published, but may be interesting for some of you as soon as it will be published. These will be results of the survey that was carried among Syrian refugees in Turkey and Sweden with respect to their experiences with respect to borders, refugee protection, reception, socioeconomic and sociocultural integration. And I will stop here regarding our project and its background and methodology, and give the floor to Marta, who will present some thoughts about the individual integration program, how does it work in Poland, and maybe with some recommendations.
Thank you, Karolina, for this introduction. So now I would like move to my part. So this is how I look like, and now I will turn off my camera just to feel comfortable while presenting, to being focused on the presentation. So give me a while just to upload the slides. Could you please confirm that you see it well?
Yes,
my presentation. Okay, so Karolina, thank you very much for this nice introduction to the project and presenting us as a team. It's my pleasure to be involved in the research under your supervision. So as you know from the brief program of today's seminar, my part will be devoted to one of the components that were discussed under the part 3 of our integration report. So part 3 was about political, legal, and institutional framework in terms of these and policies that are focused on the forced migrants. Very briefly, I would like to refer to the background of this IIP initiative, also to its legal basis, and the key components. So what does it mean in practice, this individual integration program? It means in practice that I'm not discussing all the components of the corresponding part from our report. That includes also politics and policy in the field of integration, and overview of key actors in integration governance, including crucial role of NGOs and local integration policies implemented by the cities. That is why I really encourage you to read our report after this seminar. So very briefly, I would like to start with the question, what integration policy is or is not. So in fact, it depends on the state and its approach, how this policy is framed and how this policy is treated, because very often it's considered as a component, as a part of migration or immigration policy, sometimes as a separate public policy, but very often is simply treated as part of other public policies, mostly social policies. And in this case, very often we use this term mainstreaming migrant integration. Also the latest research results even try to give the priority to something what we can consider integration policy, And this was especially discussed in the book published by Professor Duszczyk and his team under another project that was conducted in the Center of Migration Research. So the first conclusion is that it's not very easy to define, to frame the integration policy. This is also the case of Poland, because since 1989, in fact, that integration policy has been rather perceived in Poland as one of the specific policies of migration policy, and only in recent years we try to consider it as a separate one. So nowadays, what we understand as Polish integration policy is very fragmented, is very dispersed, and instead of using this term Polish integration policy, very often we say integration offer or integration activities that are developed under different public policy areas. And this was also reflected in our report. So we had specific sections devoted to integration in terms of labor market, housing, healthcare, education, and social security. In fact, if we look at the Polish case, the only integration activities that are offered by the state and the public administration are targeted at forced migrants, and not all of them, only those that are the beneficiaries of international protection, and I will elaborate on it later. And the key component of these integration activities are the already mentioned IIPs, so the individual integration programs. They are financed from the central budget, but they are implemented at the local level by local governments. And obviously, even if this integration offer is very specific and very limited only to these beneficiaries of international protection, still it could be a good basis for a future broadly defined and understood national integration policy. Here you can see the proposal developed by Dominik Wach in his paper from 2018, how we can divide the integration policy or integration activities development in case of Poland since early 1990s. I will not discuss in details, but you can see that his findings are about 4 main stages of this policy development. So from 1989 to 2000, and here we have to stress that in fact these were non-state actors that were mostly responsible for the implementation of any integration-related activities. Then the second stage, 2000-2008. So this is the time when IIPs are introduced to the law on social assistance, and refugees are covered by the integration support, social assistance. The third stage is 2008-2015. So here what is really important is the fact that the EU funds are widely used to support different integration initiatives. But also other groups of migrants are included into the projects or into the initiatives that are focused on integration, including those with subsidiary protection. So not only those granted a refugee status. And then we have the fourth, and as of now, the last period, so 2015-2018. And our cutoff on 2018 is because of the year of publication of Dominik Wach's publication. So here, obviously, we have to take into account the refugee crisis in the EU, the political consequences of the elections that took place in Poland in 2015, and it strongly influenced the migration landscape policy in the field of migration and integration. So this is about very briefly about the periodization of the Polish integration policy. And now if we would like to look at the key legal acts that we have in the field of integration of foreigners in Poland, obviously we have to focus on those that are the beneficiaries of international protection. The list of acts is very long. We included this full list with references to the Polish Polish legal references in the table 12 of our report. But here I would like to focus on 2 laws and 1 regulation. So the law of 2003 on granting protection to foreigners within the territory of the Republic of Poland, that is called the Law on Protection, and the most important legal act that we have in the field of integration of refugees and those granted subsidiary protection, so the law from 2004 on social assistance. And it is followed by the regulation of the Minister of Labour and Social Policy on the provision of assistance for foreigners of 2015. Here you may have a look at the Article 89, paragraph E. So, law on protection. A foreigner who has refugee status or enjoys subsidiary protection is provided with assistance to support his/her integration process into the society in the manner and on the terms set out in the law of 12 March 2004 on social assistance. So that is why this law on protection is the key reference document, just followed by the law on social assistance. And the flagship component of this assistance support of this integration offer that is developed under the law on social assistance is already mentioned IIP, so Individual Integration Program. A lot of articles that refer to integration support to foreigners and so on. So I will not discuss it briefly. Obviously, we have to start with Article 2. So the one that concerns the functions and organization of social assistance in Poland. Article 5, paragraph 2, foreigners. This is about the foreigners that are entitled to social assistance benefits in Poland. And here you can see that there are in fact 2 important groups. So these are not only beneficiaries of refugee status or subsidiary protection, but also members of their families. And Article 7 that indicates when this kind of assistance can be provided to forced migrants, to foreigners in Poland. So especially if they experience difficulties in integrating into the society. The key part of the law on social assistance that discusses the IIPs. This is chapter 5, so articles from 91 to 95. And what are the main assumptions of these IIPs? So firstly, a refugee, an asylum seeker granted international protection does not receive this support, is not provided this kind of support automatically. He or she has to submit a special application, and it has to be done within 60 days from the day she obtained an international protection in the Republic of Poland. Also, a given person can apply for this social assistance only in one voivodeship, so in one province, in one region. And also he or she has to confirm in writing that she is ready to participate in the integration program. The weak point of IIPs, and this is very often mentioned by the social workers involved in the implementation of the program, but also by the researchers, it takes only 1 year. So in practice, he or she can benefit from the social assistance, from this integration support provided by the local government not longer than 12 months. And Article 92 indicates precisely what is the scope of the support. So you can see that this is about the cash benefits, this is about paying health insurance, this is about providing social work in everyday life of a refugee. This is also specialist counseling, including legal, psychological, and family support. This is also about providing information how to interact with different stakeholders, institutional stakeholders, but also local community and NGOs on a daily basis. But these are also other activities that support the foreigners integration process. So, for example, what are the Polish customs? What are the rules? And so on and so on. So IIP usually takes the form of a written contract, a written agreement. There are two parties of this contract, and both parties have very specific obligations agreed under IIP. So from the one side, we have the institution from the local government side. So this is Powiat Family Support Center. And on the other hand, we have the foreigners obligations. So simply the person with a refugee status, subsidiary protection, or their family members. So the list is very long. It's based, in fact, on what we've just discussed on the basis of the Article 92. Here, I would like to pay your attention to the obligations of the Powiat Family Support Center, point 3. So, assistance in obtaining housing. So what does it mean? So in fact, it does not mean that the local government offer housing or active search of private accommodation. In fact, it means rather providing some useful information and details about the domestic and local housing market, but also different housing options. So sometimes a given Powiat Family Support Center is able to provide social or protected housing. Also, there are some special programs that provide housing, especially in big cities. So we discussed it in our report in the section devoted to accommodation. So this is what we have, in fact, in the law on social assistance. So this is what is on the paper. The practice is very different, and I assume that my colleagues will tell you more about the practice of the IIP implementation on a daily basis in case of housing, education, and labor market in a while. But the question is, if we are able to assess, to evaluate this integration process that is the result of these IIPs. So technically, what is said by the paragraph 5 of the regulation on assistance to foreigners, this integration process under IIP should be monitored by the social worker from the Family Support Center at least once every 3 months. And technically, this integration progress should cover 3 areas. So language education, the so-called professional functioning, and the so-called social functioning. However, the assessment is rather soft because it's mostly based on the observation that is made by the social worker. So the worker, the employee of the Powiat Family Support Center, responsible for the implementation of this given IIP for a given foreigner, but also it is based on the interactions and conversations with the foreigner, with the refugee himself, and her family members. And finally, this is also based on the opinions of other employees from other institutions and organizations, for example, NGOs that are involved in the integration process of a given foreigner. For example, those that are responsible for language training or that Powiat labor offices. And the assessment takes the form, I would say, only of a written memo. So it's not very formalized. So it's in fact delivered in a very soft way. Obviously, this might be discussed in terms of the efficiency of the IIPs. And in terms of the numbers, here I would like to refer to the data that were collected by Dominik Bach from different sources. And the number of families that were covered by the IAPs from 2000, when the IAPs were implemented for the very first time, till 2017, it's almost 6,000, and obviously most of them were implemented in the Mazovian voivodeship, so 62%. That's very obvious because here we have Warsaw, so the capital city, the city with the highest number of foreigners, with the biggest labor market. And it was followed by 2 voivodeships having external border of Poland, so eastern border of Poland. It's Podlaski and Lublin voivodeships. And having this Mazovian voivodeship with the highest number of families covered by the IAPs, this is obviously the Warsaw Family Support Center that was the most active in terms of providing this integration support for refugees and people with subsidiary protection. And unfortunately, and it was also stressed by the report of the Supreme Audit Office in 2015, not only obviously Warsaw Family Support Center, also is the case of other family support centers, the number of social workers that are responsible for the IAPs, that are responsible for working with the families, refugee families on a daily basis, is not enough. I mean, there are many families and only few social workers. In case of Warsaw, I'm not sure how is it now in late 2020. In early 2020, these were the number of 4 people. And if you'd like to learn more about this political, legal, and institutional section concerning our report, I encourage you simply to read the report after our seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, for this short presentation of very broad topic. And I give the floor to Konrad, who will present all the issues related with, maybe not chosen issues related with housing and spatial integration.
Can you, Karolina, please confirm that my presentation is visible?
Yes, your session is visible.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Karolina and Marta, for introducing research and the findings. Obviously, what is the most important, or one of the most important elements of the research is the fieldwork and the results of this fieldwork. And what I'm going to do within this 15 minutes or so is to tell you a little bit about one of the aspects of one of the dimensions of integration we've been covering in the report, namely housing. There are other dimensions as well which I worked on, namely health and also the importance of religion. But there's no time for that, so I'll just cover housing and spatial integration. So just set the scene for what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quote 2 excerpts from interviews with our meso level respondents, informants. One of them said, quote, "We provide integration," and here mainly the person referred to IAPs, "but without foundation from which it could start. It is obvious that if someone has problem with paying for his or her apartment, or has no financial means to sustain himself or herself, then they will not think about learning Polish or somehow cultivate themselves culturally. This is the Maslow pyramid level above. And we didn't provide the basic ones." And another quote, which I think very nicely sets the scene and really captures a lot of elements that I'm going to cover in a second, is the following one. "The lack of automatic access to cheap housing is what I consider the biggest barrier in the integration process. It seems to me that this is the first human need, to ensure a sense of security when you have a roof over your head. Only then you can think about work, qualifications, retraining, etc." So basically, housing as one of the most important basic needs that all persons seeking asylum or those who obtained some form of international protection must be provided with or have to satisfy this needs individually. The quality, obviously, of this provision is absolutely crucial when we consider all other aspects of integration, adaptation of foreigners to any sort of sociocultural conditions. And obviously, it has a very important impact on the mental condition of individuals and entire families who, most of the cases, have been very seriously experienced in their home countries. What is important is that the end of provision of accommodation in the Center for Foreigners and ends also housing allowance, and this is 2 months from the date of delivery of the final decision on granting international protection. It was mentioned by Marta, IIPs, they are entitled to receive monthly cash benefits to cover, among other, housing costs. Sometimes housing assistance is implemented as part of Powiat's own tasks, so there are some special projects, but in practice, it means generally it's the local authorities is the only or major gateway to special or dedicated housing solutions for refugees. And here is an example from Warsaw, so where, but as you could see, as it was shown by Marta, Mazovian Voivodship is one of the most important ones in implementing various projects, and here one of the projects which was providing very important support for the refugees. It is rare in Poland that local authorities provide refugees with free or of charge access to apartment. One of the exceptions was the WITEK, which was Warsaw Task Project on Integration of Foreigners with regard to needs of the labor market, which was implemented between 2017 and 2019. And as we can see from other reports, and one of them was the NIC report on beneficiaries of IPs, they most often lived in premises rented on the free market. Only a few families used a protected flat or flat from the commune's housing stock. Housing assistance consisted of providing foreigners only with information on possible forms of access to flats. And some of the major challenges which we see in our research, which sort of were visible from the research data, were the following. When it comes to housing provision for the beneficiaries of integration of international protection, because in this report we just look at the beneficiaries. In the earlier report we looked at the reception, so people who were awaiting the decision on their status. So some of the key problems were limited supply of affordable housing, high rental costs, especially in large cities. Partially these two are linked and partially they are not. So that's why I separated the two things. Discriminatory practices in the housing market, the lack of specialized housing counseling for beneficiaries of international protection, and the risk of homelessness after the end of institutional support under IIP programs. So these are some of the key challenges, and let me discuss from the project data each of these issues. So and first, what I'm going to do is I'll present these challenges from the perspective of non-state actors, so NGOs and those meso actors who are actively participating in the implementation of the integration of beneficiaries of international protection, and then I will discuss it from the perspective of the actual beneficiaries, so persons with international protection. So, as one of our interviewees said, housing is one of those things that do not work in Poland at all. Our experience often shows that when we talk about a problem that affects refugees, we de facto talk about a problem that affects everyone. The refugees have just a harder time than the rest of the society with the same problem. And here, the big question is, to what extent the issue with obtaining a housing, a decent housing, is something which is similar to other residents of the country and other citizens of the country, or to what extent is dissimilar. So obviously, this one line of argumentation goes as follows, that difficulty of finding adequate housing by persons with refugee status or other type of international protection is part of a general shortage of affordable housing. And we have all sorts of data showing that there is a huge shortage of approximately over 2 million houses in Poland. So this is part of it. But obviously there is this argumentation which shows as certain elements of discriminatory also practices in the housing market. And one of them goes along these lines, that if there are not enough houses for us, we should not provide them to aliens, to foreigners. And this is one of the arguments that that comes up often in the discussion when the housing provision for refugees or beneficiaries of international protection is being discussed. So discriminatory practices in the housing market make it increasingly difficult for refugees to gain access to decent housing. This is the finding of our research. And one of the quotes that shows that is the following: if persons with accent inquire about a given flat, they much more often hear that the offer is not valid. When a young Chechen couple was looking for an apartment, a few times they had a situation that the landlords agreed to give them the apartment for a rent, but later refused to do so when they learned that they were from Chechnya. More recently, this couple was going to sign a contract, and when the owners saw that the girl was in hijab, although she spoke perfect Polish, they refused to sign it. So it's one of the examples we have from the data. And obviously there is all sorts of information, especially analyzing the processes of securitization of forced migration within the last 5 years, which show how the perception of, the social perception of persons with beneficiaries of international protection has changed. And one of the studies I quote here is a study which I carried out with Agnieszka Legut, which we show how the securitization of the discourse over refugees has changed the social perception of refugees. And obviously what we see in this data from our research is that this has a direct impact on refugees themselves when they, for example, search for flats. The problem with flats also forces refugees to leave Poland because in the West it is easier to find a flat and there are fewer prejudices. Another respondent said, if you depend only on your source of income, you may find it difficult to pay for the rent of the flat where you live. And this may be the moment when people decide to leave Poland. If people are wondering why Poland is still a transit country, it seems to me that the key issue has to do with access to affordable housing. And this, so basically having means to rent a decent flat. And or search for it or find it. And here, what we discuss in the report, and here I just want to mention this, is the super important role of NGO sector that helps beneficiaries of international protection to search for flats. They provide legal advice and support in applying for social housing, also providing financial support. And there are plenty of organizations. One of the mostly quoted ones in our research were the following ones, those which you can see, but there are obviously many, many others. So when it comes now to the situation of beneficiaries of international protection, what we have noticed in the research data is the transition. So moving from the centers for foreigners to live outside of them. And the research data shows that those persons who seem to have particularly big problems with finding the right accommodation are those who have been living in one of the refugee centers financed by the Center for Foreigners. So as we've showed also in the earlier report, the majority of asylum seekers decide to live outside of such centers and seem to learn about the difficulties of finding adequate housing at the earliest stage of their stay in Poland. One of our interviewees who was in a difficult situation during the transition from a family, with a family from the refugee center to live outside of the center, pointed out that we had 3-4 days in a center and then we were about to be on the street. She was also surprised that a small allowance paid to her and members of her family would stop being paid. There's also the problem in a transition between moving out of the Center for Foreigners and getting registered with the IIP program. So this is a crucial moment when people may end up being homeless, but obviously it's important to mention also that there is research, a very important one, which also defines the experience of living in a collective, for example, areas in a reception sort of period as also a semi-homelessness situation. But we obviously, the situation may be even worse in a way after someone obtain a refugee status, which is paradoxical in a way. So the support is crucial, and there are all sorts of organizations, for example, that come here, and one of them is, for example, Chleby Misolom. So here is a quote: "I called Chleby Misolom, they took photo of us and in the center, and I met a woman from Kyrgyzstan, and she was also moving out from the center. We agreed to look for a flat together since we could share the bills, and together we had 1,500 zlotych. So Chleby Misolom found a house for us, they collected things for us, and I was very grateful. It was like a fairy tale to us that we moved out from the center, that we received a status." So in this case, for this particular interviewee, this was a happy sort of story, and due to help from NGO, here is another example, help by Ocalenie Foundation, who partially pays a house rent, partially it's paid by the foundation. I've been living here for more than 4 months. We have all the necessary furniture supply. So NGO sector. Sometimes ethnic support is also important. So here one of the respondents said our Chechen friends were living here before and they had planned to move. They asked if we wanted to take it. We didn't. We did because before we were living in one-room apartment. So crowding, it's obviously one of the problems. Other networks. Maybe just the social, so here is one of the examples of other type of sectors. The woman from my daughter's school helped me. Her neighbor works in administration. He helped me to find this flat. So it may be all sorts of situations. One of the last slides, it's about social housing. So obviously, beneficiaries of international protection have the chances of obtaining it, but it's super difficult. Here are examples how people are expecting to be eligible for social housing. As you can see, person is optimistic and say maybe after 10 years we'll get it. Another person that we interviewed said, I cannot rent a bigger room than 6 square meters for one person, as I have applied for a social flat. If I rent a bigger room, they will not give me the flat. They will tell me that I have enough space. So it's interesting that applying for social housing keeps them in a situation that they living in a degraded sort of situation. So discrimination, as I mentioned, a very important problem. So a quick quote: it was very difficult to find a flat because the owners refused to rent them to refugees or the foreigners. After 10th refusal, I thought, how come one receives the protection but cannot find a flat? It was difficult. And so final slide about a few recommendations to discuss, if we have time during the next session, making the transition from refugee centers to housing easier for persons with international protection. We can discuss all sort of ideas how this could be done. Improving access to cheaper and more adequate housing to refugees and persons with subsidiary protection. Providing more support to the NGOs facilitating spatial integration of migrants. Generally paying more attention to spatial integration of persons with international protection. And finally, providing easier access to social housing for persons with international protection. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm done. Who is next?
Thank you, Konrad, for your presentation. Before I will give the floor to Justyna, let me say what was already written in the chat window, that we encourage you to write a question in the chat window, as the time for question and answer session will be limited, and we'll try to answer for as many as possible, however, with some limitations. Okay, Justyna, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the floor, and hello to everyone once again. Now I will tell you more about integration of refugees in area of education, but I will focus only on adult refugees, since actually we cover in our report also children refugees, but we didn't do any interviews with the minors. So I would like to present you more a perspective of refugees. So then I will focus only on adults, and I will briefly present you the structure of my presentation. So firstly, I will present the legal framework, then I will show you the main findings from our research, but I will focus on challenges faced by refugees, and then I will show you or present you the recommendations in a way of thinking how we can improve integration in education or specific aspects of this integration. So there are like two important dimensions of education of adult refugees. The first one is access to schools and universities, and the second one is access to language education. Regarding the first one, we have access to school, access to universities, and recognition of diplomas and prior education that is really very much related to the previous two. And the second one, access to language education, this is like basis of integration in every country. And within this, I will tell you more about how the access look like from the integration EIP program, and do we have some courses for free provided by NGOs, and how refugees can access and can join these courses. So regarding the legal acts that that cover this issue, we have the law on school education that refers to access to school. And basing on this law, refugees, meaning all beneficiaries of international protection in Poland, have access to education in public school for adults, post-secondary schools, art schools, and so on, under the conditions applicable to Polish citizens. So we have the equality of rights here. Regarding access to universities, we have law on higher education and science from 2018, pretty new law. And refugees also have access to universities under the conditions applicable to Polish citizens. But you may imagine that it actually raises some questions how to do it when there is some requirement to complete the secondary level education, have it maturity certificate, and confirmation all the grades that were received from at the previous education and so on. So this is actually the problem. and we have some procedures how to get it over, but the procedures aren't ideal, we may say. And the procedures are regulated in Law and Education System of 1991, but also by some ordinances of Minister of Higher Education. And basing on this law, there is a procedure of confirmation education, previous education of a refugee, in a way that the Mazovian Education Superintendent can confirm the level of previous education, can confirm the educational qualification when there are some difficulties with provisional and original diploma, original certificate, and so on, and authentication of such certificate. And this procedure can be used to confirm the primary, lower secondary, and vocational and upper secondary level of education. In terms of confirmation of higher education for refugees, then universities have to be somehow involved in this procedure. And it can be done, but it's not very easy. And the second very important dimension of integration of adult refugees in education is, of course, access to Polish language learning and also Polish language learning itself. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, refugees are obliged to learn Polish language, but only if they are participant of individual integration program and if their knowledge of Polish is not at a sufficient level. It means that they can have access to Polish language learning, not for free, but all the expenses then are reimbursed to them, not longer than for 12 months, since this individual integration program cannot last longer. So regardless of whether they know Polish, whether their knowledge of Polish is at sufficient level, they cannot have like more the Polish language courses for more than 12 months. Of course, they can have it when they are willing to find the courses for themselves, like the courses organized by NGOs or some foundations and so on, but it requires some additional work for them, additional like market orientation and so on. And there is no like institutional help for them. And as mentioned before, refugees should cover expenses of Polish language courses, but by themselves, but the expenses are reimbursed within and under the framework of IAP. And the participation in IAP does not include automatic registering for the courses, and it of course depends on the courses availability, but also on some like specific needs and additional issues encountered by refugees. And now let me tell you more about Polish language learning reality. Firstly, there was a report of Supreme Audit Office, no, Supreme Control Audit, Supreme Audit Office, I guess. It's Najwyższa Izba Kontroli, NIK, of 2015. And in this report, NIK identified that only, on average, only 35% of beneficiaries of IAP participated in Polish language classes. And of course, it varied depending on the locality. The participation was the highest in Warsaw, but the lowest in some smaller localities like Proszków, Łuków, and so on. And the number of Polish lesson hours during IAP the average number of Polish lesson hours was 4 hours per week. And Nick also found this insufficient at all in order to learn the language at a sufficient level to communicate. And what about findings from our own research? The research, as Karolina mentioned already, were based on interviews like meso-level and micro-level interviews. And mainly I will focus on micro-level interviews since these interviews showed us the real experiences of refugees. And actually, interestingly, refugees, of course, know that the language is important for the successful integration, and majority, or almost, I think almost all of them wanted to learn the language very well in order to communicate, in order to live in Poland, and do not have any problems with either administration or society. And this was like shared by almost everyone. And what were the challenges? So the most frequent ones repeated by our respondents was that the time of the courses overlaps with working hours, so they cannot really attend the classes, since they really need to work in order to pay for the flat, pay for that apartment in order to survive, because these cash benefits that they are receiving within the IAP is mainly not enough to make a normal living. So this was like very interesting, because firstly, it is the social worker from the Powiat Family Support Center who is somehow responsible for this dimension of integration to help the refugee, the beneficiary of international protection, to find a course, to register for the course, and so on. But social workers themselves knew that the priority for refugees is work, and if there is conflict of, or we can say, interest between taking a job or participating in language course, refugees actually prefer to just work, and social workers acknowledge that and do not force them to participate in language courses. There were also some complaints about the quality and effectiveness of the courses, and these were faced by respondents, refugees who took the courses, and they said that they didn't learn much of language during the courses, and the courses weren't very efficient since they did not have many conversations and so on. So it means that the courses did not follow the communicative way of teaching, meaning that the communication should be treated as a priority in teaching refugees or beneficiaries of international protection. Meaning, and it was another finding, that in reality, that when there is no centralized system of Polish language learning, then can be such problems, and there are some efforts to get it over. Like, for example, there are some NGOs or foundations that deal with this problem. One of them is Lingua Mundi, a foundation on language, Polish language learning school, which prepared a guidebook for Polish language learning and published this guidebook and offered some kind of methodology for teaching not only refugees but migrants. And actually this guide is really good, but apparently not every school, not every language school uses it. So it should be like much more common. And this kind of thinking that we need some kind of tool, educational tool for teaching, especially refugees. Of course, migrants as a whole, but within migrants, refugees, it should be important for at least Ministry of Education. Okay, the next challenges that we encountered during our research was unavailability of courses. It wasn't common, so this is maybe not so worrisome, but apparently in some smaller locations, not in Warsaw, but in, for example, Łomża, or in some Lubelski voivodeship like Wohyń or Zalesie, the courses weren't available for refugees, and if they want to participate in such a course, they could go they could go to some distant location, to a bigger city. And some refugees compared this situation with Germany, because there were also some respondents that had experience of applying for asylum in Germany. And they said that in Germany, the courses are very common and it is easy to join the course and so on, because they are everywhere. But in case of Poland, it can be kind of hard to find a course that teaches you everything, not only Polish language, but also Polish culture, more about Polish people and so on. And they also highlighted the importance to have some Polish friends or Poles who can speak to. And the next issue was that the courses do not meet the specific needs of particular groups. And it was mentioned also very frequently. Especially we saw some groups that really need more care than that they experience now. The first group is elderly people, so apparently it is really hard for them to learn the language, and they should be more. There should be some courses maybe tailored to their needs, or some other methods, like for example communicative methods, should be used in courses provided to them. Also, there were some issues with providing appropriate courses for people from different cultural background, since, for example, as some practitioners said to us that, for example, Muslim women cannot go to courses if their husband won't let them to do it. And maybe it is like stereotype or like general observation made by Polish practitioners. It should be highlighted, but still, even during our research, we encountered some issues, for example, with encouraging especially women to take part in the research and to give the interview to us, and the Muslim women, since they need to have this approval of their husbands. Okay, do I have more time or not?
Not too much.
Not too much. Okay, so maybe I will skip this universities as actors, because it's not that was mentioned in our research and in the interviews. And lack of documents, maybe I will take a couple of more words about that. So as you can imagine, for refugees, it is a problem to have like firstly documents, because sometimes they do not have any documents that would confirm their education, since they pack in a hurry, or they don't want to lose the documents during their journey. And the second issue is are difficulties with confirmation of their prior education. For example, they started university in their countries of origin, but they cannot like continue their studies in Poland since there is no such a procedure, or the procedure is really difficult and applicable only or in majority for EU students and EU universities. Yeah.
So go to the recommendations. Yeah.
Yeah. So the recommendations, there are actually two. In terms of Polish language courses, they should be provided to all beneficiaries of international protection for free. Regarding the time, they shouldn't be limited only to 12 months. And specific needs of specific groups should be taken into account, like elderly groups, women with kids, some people from different culture. Maybe weekend and online courses should be offered as well in order to somehow get over this work and taking part in course challenge. And procedure of the education confirmation should be facilitated and be more accessible to refugees, and all the waves should be, all the fees should be waived. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stina, for your presentation and your recommendations that were delivered also with our report. And last but not least will be part dedicated to labor markets and the experiences and opinions of practitioners regarding the challenges and as well recommendations. But before this, I would like to focus on the issue why actually we should treat refugees and asylum seekers especially on the labor market. And in this place, we should remember that both asylum seekers and refugees, and here each time when I talk about refugees, I mean beneficiaries of international protection, so any form of protection that they are covered with. So they integrate into the labor market in a much more difficult way than other migrants, even if their skills and education are comparable. This difference occurs regardless of the age group and knowledge of the host country language. It takes 6 years for refugees to achieve the level of employment and income similar to those migrating due to family reunion, and 15 years in order to reach the level of the native population. It was the result of the EOCD report or research carried or published in 2016. And the reasons that lay behind this is of course already mentioned, lack of language proficiency, but also the lack of social and professional networks, psychological distress and disabilities, often related with trauma after fleeing the origin regions. Behind this is also the period of suspension and uncertainty about the future during asylum procedure. Also, we need to remember that they gain their qualifications and work experience in difficult labor market conditions. Also already mentioned by Justina, lack of proper documentations to prove their education and skills. And finally, very often lack of or very weak attachment to the host country. So how does it look like in Poland regarding the legal regulations? How they asylum seekers gain the access to labor market after a positive decision. So all persons covered with protection receiving the refugee status or any other subsidiary protection have rights similar to those enjoyed by Polish citizens. And this includes access to the labor market, right to protection against unemployment, and the right to conduct business activity. The beneficiaries of international protection have access to jobs in public sector, such as work in education or health services, unless there are specific regulations requiring Polish citizenship, for instance, in so-called core of public sector, as civil servants or police. So we can say that they have almost the same rights as Polish citizens. However, despite this and despite their special needs, there are no regulations to link the placement of asylum seekers and refugees with employment opportunities. As well, there are no special programs, additional incentives, or benefits aimed at encouraging employers to employ beneficiaries of international protection other than those who receive those concerning employment of Polish citizens. So if someone is, for instance, unemployed for a long term or unemployed up to 30 years old, then he can rely on the same benefits as those Poles. Also, vulnerable beneficiaries of international protection on the labor market are not treated as a group requiring special treatment. So what's the response, or how does the practitioners from public institutions work within this? So programs offered by the district labor offices are addressed to all beneficiaries of the office, and are not tailored programs, and are not tailored for migrants, and especially they are not tailored for refugees. More active in this area are big cities, which provide some activities for integration purposes. Some of them, or I would say even most of them, are carried with cooperation with non-governmental organizations. They focus on creation of units dedicated to problems of foreigners, and not only refugees, but foreigners as such. They create strategic documents and some try to implement projects targeted at migrants and or refugees. More active, or I would even say that Polish NGOs play an invaluable role in helping migrants and refugees. It is not different in the area of integration on the labor market. I divided this help or this support into 4 areas. The first is assistance with bureaucratic issues related to access to labor market. They give support of experts who can help understand Polish law, find a job in Poland, or set up a business. They help in creating cooperation between employers and migrants, and this is like 2 ways. So first of all, they motivate migrants to actively search employment and fight against stereotypes. And on the other side, they facilitate participation of refugees in internships by creating or giving or offering preferable conditions for employers. Then we have this individual support, which is addressed towards needs and possibilities of refugee women, which are most of all vulnerable group, as most usually they are single mothers, or maybe not usually, but very often they're single mothers who need special treatment. And finally, NGOs play important role in fighting discriminatory behaviors by the employer or potential employer. So regarding the barriers, Justyna already mentioned language, and also regarding the labor market, it is the first and the main problem, as one of our Chechen interviewees said. Information, and this is both like during working, but most of all when we face the effort to access the labor market. Information in vast majority of the district labor offices, web pages, as well as trainings are available mostly in Polish. Therefore, foreigners have limited access to the offer of labor offices. Moreover, even as one of our practitioners mentioned, it is not so bad when we do a tailor course in Russian, but in Arabic, so the language also makes a difference. And even if someone finishes such a course in Russian or Arabic, anyway, they will not get a job because they do not speak Polish. Further, one of our Iraqi interviewees admitted that in order to learn anything to help me find the work, they said it means that the institutions or workers from labor office say that it's not possible unless you know Polish language. I mean, it was not available in English language. Justyna mentioned recognition of diplomas, but also, but it's very important to highlight that in Poland, those who cannot validate their qualifications work far below their competences. Although it is common among migrants, it is much more frequent and visible among beneficiaries of international protection. In Poland, this challenge does not affect the process of integration only, but also the willingness to stay in the country. So this is somehow the opposite argument to Konrad's presentation when he said that it's housing issue, but here also this possibility to work only below the qualifications also push people to move further to Western Europe. This lack of training offer is also related with lack of monitoring of how these trainings are carried, and also that employment rate remains low after the trainings. Also, data regarding trainings and effectiveness of programs dedicated to refugees are not collected in a systematic way. And here we need to highlight that lack of procedures for skill validation and recognition of qualifications causes significant loss of potential vulnerable workers who are willing to integrate into labor market. And even if not entirely within their competences, then at least within sector where they had received education and qualifications. Also, the training offer does not correspond neither to the jobs further taken by foreigners, but also to the market needs. As one of practitioners said, that institutions in Poland organize manicure, pedicure, hairdressing, and gastronomy courses, and nobody will accept someone as a hairdresser after a 2-week hairdressing course, or even a monthly one. Internships and such trainings are needed. There's a problem with this. And also regarding trainings, it's important also to include into the frame of trainings employers or potential employers who are confused with our legal system of employment of foreigners, and they perceive this as complicated, and they are not aware whether they can or cannot employ a foreigner even under one of protection forms. Those are also the other reasons lay behind that quite a significant number of refugees decide for informal employment. And besides those already mentioned arguments, we should mention also those triggers as discrimination by some employers who think that foreigners can be employed informally and work for less money when they are desperate. And also the other issue that though refugees who doesn't have or do not have high education level perform simple and low paid jobs, and even if they work a lot, they may not earn enough to pay all bills, so they decide to work informally to have more in their pocket. Also, the sectors where they work play a role, as sectors such as construction, transportation, gastronomy, domestic work, and car repairment are the jobs where it's often undocumented job is a basis for this. So how does it influence our sample? In our sample, among 70 respondents with protection status, 10 men and 7 women, all of them had work experience mostly from their country of origin. 7 reported no change in their situation, just 7 on the labor market. So they used to work as unskilled or skilled worker, and they still work in the same, let's say, level. 7 reported a worse situation on the labor market. 2 became unemployed and 2 unskilled workers. Those 5 unemployed that were women who were not able to work due to family reasons. And 2 from Syria reported an improved situation. How does it look regarding the job which they perform? It's construction, agriculture, security, cleaning, gastronomy, trade, and transport. And here on this diagram, you can see that those which are in bright colors, these are during procedure, and in navy ones, these are already after the decision. So what are the recommendations? First of all, we should treat pre-integration on labor market as part of integration process. Therefore, already during asylum procedure activities dedicated to asylum seekers that include not only learning of the language, but also acquisition of work skills and recognition of qualifications should be carried out. Also, beneficiaries of international protection should be treated as separated privileged group and should be covered by tailored trainings organized by district labor offices. Also, programs dedicated to beneficiaries and refugees should merge both improvement of qualifications and gaining new skills as well learning of Polish language. It is also highly recommended to treat beneficiaries of international protection as privileged group who benefit from special integration programs, such as exceptions from internships or additional payment for internship or exemptions from contribution towards the state during employment of this kind of person. So we should encourage employers to hire refugees. And finally, improvement of monitoring. So we need to be aware who is in Poland under protection what kind of skills and qualifications do they have. The results of acquisition of work skills and recognition of qualification dedicated to refugees should be monitored, evaluated and improved adequately to the needs of specific groups arriving in Poland. And finally, it is crucial to systematically monitor the process of integration of this group of people. Before I will give the floor to my colleagues, I would like to those who became more interested in the result of the project as such, to invite for the final response conference that it will be held online 21st November. And the registration will be possible on respondmigration.com webpage. Thank you for your attention here. I skip the sharing of the screen and give the floor to Konrad, I believe, who will answer for the first question.
All right. Thank you very much for the questions. There are very important ones. All of them are super important. I will start from the last one. Asked by Renata Stefańska, could a private sponsoring be a solution to the housing problems of refugees in Poland? Co-financing the costs of renting apartment for a certain period by private persons or companies. Could it work in Poland? Yes, I think it's sponsoring generally. I think it's a good idea. When we look at the examples from European countries, also from elsewhere, one of the very good examples is Canada, which has this system, and a very substantial number of refugees who come to Canada, actually those who are sponsored, but not by private persons or companies, but most of the time by religious organizations. And in a way, we may say that, that this idea of private sponsoring it's on the table since 2015 in Poland. This is precisely the idea of humanitarian corridors and the more active role of Catholic Church in the reception and integration of refugees in Poland. But as you know, Renata, this has not been given a green light by the government. So, but as generally, I think there are all sorts of pros and cons of the situation. I don't have time to go into discussing them now, but generally, I think it is a way forward and it could be a good idea. When it comes to research, the other two questions by Marta Jaroszewicz and Maria Pamuła, I think these two questions are in essence about the same issue, namely the situation of beneficiaries of international protection on the housing market. What affects why their situation is in a way, or can be in a way, more, I would say, sensitive. They may be more in danger to discrimination than other types of persons who are non-foreigners or foreigners. Like, I would say generally it's that foreigners would be in a more, I would say, unprivileged situation when it comes to housing market because of the structural conditions of this market. So yes, people who are registered in Poland, who have documents, would be probably seen by the owners of the houses as more reliable. Then if the families, if this persons who are renting the houses is a big family, obviously this is also, and this is a question by Maria Pamuła, this type of tenant is seen in general, and we know it from other research from housing market, it is not a preferable sort of tenant. So so from this, because of the structural characteristics of the beneficiaries of international protection, they are more prone to discrimination than other types of foreigners we claim in the report. Very briefly. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Konrad. Justyna, there will also come some questions regarding the education. Can you shortly respond to them?
Okay, so replying to Elizabeth Peck. So yeah, you are right. There is lack of appropriate training for Polish language teachers, and it is also related with lack of centralized system of teaching Polish to foreigners, also divided into different language groups. Also, you can find more about this problem in our report. When, of course, it is based on qualitative material data, like interviews with refugees, but there were big differences in learning Polish by Ukrainian refugees and non-Ukrainian, like Chechens, Syrian, and so on. So it also can be found in the report. But actually, there are some schools, private language schools, who started to face this issue. And these are Instytut Kształcenia Obcokrajowców, sorry, I don't know the name in English, and Lingua Mundi school, and they actually work on some methodology, and they divide foreigners into linguistic groups, so they actually make it easier for foreigners to acquire some Polish language knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Justyna. And just for the last question from Marta Jaroszewicz regarding the labor market, as I said, it's extremely challenging to provide any statistic on employment of refugees in Poland, as there is a huge gap in monitoring of this issue. As far as I know, maybe I'm wrong, but please then correct me, but we did not manage to get to any data, neither from the Ministry of Family, Labor, Family and Social Policy, nor just a couple of reports were quite, I would say, elderly to say that this is relevant to our project. If there are no more questions, I will, if there are no more questions, there is one more to Elizabeth. I encourage all of you to email to us, to authors of the report, or look for more precise information in the report, as they are already published on the webpage of the project. We'll also give the link to the report on our Facebook webpage, where this our seminar was recommended or announced. And thank you for Marta, Konrad, and Justina for your presentations, for your voice, and thank you all people who participated in our seminar for your attention, and I encourage you to contact us further. Thank you very much.